love this part.
Welcome to AIDS to Scouting. Friends all over the world, not just scouts, but people, young people, people who are in charge of helping young people understand and make their way into the world and get ready for the responsibilities of citizenship. Tonight, we are going to have again, as a second time, Dr. Douglas Young. He's a college professor of history and political science at North Georgia College, or was. I think he retired. But at any rate, but Doug is a friend of mine. We've known each other for years. And the other
Decades.
night, yeah, decades. And the other night, I heard him give a lecture down in Zebulon, Georgia, and about a guy named General Longstreet, who was a Confederate general during the American Civil War or the war between the states, whichever way you want to call it. And so I thought that it was a tremendously interesting lecture because
Thank
Doug
you.
Doug just knew it heart and soul, so he didn't have notes or anything, and he went on and on. And so he talked a lot about Longstreet before the war and then during the war, but then after the war. And I kind of want to emphasize a lot tonight and have a discussion about Longstreet after the war. And I think some of you will find from this discussion that maybe some of the history that you've been taught is wrong or it's not been complete. And it's a way, and for all of us as scouts, we need to understand history. History is important. And a lot of kids get bored with history. They don't read history. They just accept the history that's been fed to them by the school systems and by Hollywood or whatever their local country wants to put out. I can remember seeing some old Russian Revolution communist films about things that were obvious distortions of what happened. And so the complexity of Longstreet as get this, a civil rights hero. That's one of the things that I was surprised because I didn't know that much about General Longstreet other than he was a very good military officer. So with that, Doug, how about it? Why don't you give a little introduction of yourself and then talk about the early times of General Longstreet, and we'll interrupt you as we see fit. How does that sound?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me back. I really enjoyed our last podcast together, and I am just so honored and delighted to be back again. And I applaud you and Elliot for all that y'all do for the cause of scouting. It is a noble cause, and God bless you both. Now, in terms of my history, I was born in Bartow, Florida in 1961, reared mostly in Athens, Georgia. My parents were educators, and my major in college and graduate school was political science. And my first job was, and my only full-time job was as a professor. And my first professorial gig was at Gordon College in Barnesville, Georgia, in Middle Georgia. And that is near Zebulon and Molina, where Walker, of course, you're from. And that's how we met. And I taught at Gordon College, named for Confederate General John B. Gordon, from 1987 to 99. And then from 1999 through the end of 2020, I taught at what is now the Gainesville campus of the University of North Georgia. I taught political science and history at both colleges. And I have, for about 40 years, been an essayist Very blessed to get a number of essays published in a variety of newspapers and magazines and publications around the world. And since retiring from the professoriate in December of 2020, I've been a full-time writer and a speaker. I've been very blessed to get a couple of novels published. And the first is Deep in the Forest. The second is Due South. They're both dramedies or comedy dramas. And I had 2 books of essays published. This Little Opinion plus $1.50 will buy you a Coke, political essays, and not just political, which is a collection of mostly non-political essays. And then I'm delighted to report that my most recent book that was just published in late May is my first book of short stories called The Double Date and Other Stories. And it's 15 tales that take place in the present day, almost all of which in small town Dixie. And most of the stories are humorous, and they're a lot of fun. And I'm so touched and honored that the reviews for my books have been very, very good.
Where can we find these books?
Thank you so much. You can find them via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I think just about any online bookstore website.
I think I may have neglected to put these on, like links to these books on the last podcast, like in the description. I should have. I'm sorry.
No problem. And it's never too late to add them. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Making notes as well. I wonder what happened to Booker. Oh, there he is.
Oh,
I was eating something my wife had cooked, and it was delicious, and so I just couldn't resist. So
please give her my best regards.
Doug, tell us why Longstreet.
I love talking about James Longstreet because of all the hundreds or thousands of historical figures that I was blessed to lecture about for over a third of a century. Longstreet is one of the very few great men of history who was also extremely good. I think that he is such an inspirational role model because he is somebody who was deeply, devoutly Christian, who was absolutely uncompromising in his commitment to his faith and to following it in every aspect of his life. And even though he was so very often, typically in the minority, whether it was on the battlefield of war or on the battlefield of politics, he absolutely stayed true to his principles, even though he suffered terribly politically and personally, but he was absolutely loyal to his causes, and he had the courage, he had the foresight to be about a century ahead of his time on various important issues. And even though he suffered greatly for being so far ahead of his time, he did not bend to opposing public opinion. And I'm delighted that before he died, his reputation started to come up even in his own lifetime. And I'm thrilled that today his reputation is absolutely better than ever. Militarily, politically, you name it.
If I could sort of interrupt, for those who don't have any idea what we're talking about here, General Longstreet was on the staff and was commanded one of the corps of the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. And
right, he was the second highest ranking general in the entire Confederate Army. And he is regarded by many people as the best commander on either side of the war.
Well, and also I just wanted to say that Doug was in his lecture the other night. I learned so much, and one of them was that Longstreet was not a slave owner, and had never been, and
he opposed secession too.
Opposed secession, but then felt that under the circumstances that he should offer his services to the Confederacy. And so that's one of the complexities of history
Right.
that we want to kind of touch. Well, actually, we want everybody to think about, because we think, the war was fought for to end slavery,
Right.
but great many. How many, Doug? What percentage of Southern soldiers were actual slave owners?
A really small percentage. In fact, at the time of the war between the states, between 1861 and 1865, only one of every 15 Southern Caucasians owned a slave. It was a really small minority of Southerners who did. And that is reflected in the Confederate Army. A very small percentage of the soldiers owned slaves. And I think that if you could read the letters of Confederate soldiers, I don't know if you would find any that said that they were fighting for slavery. And also, if you look at the letters written by Union soldiers, very few of them would have said, we're fighting to free the slaves. Remember when it's such a horrible tragedy that, like the whole wide world, slavery had always been the norm. And that's not to excuse a single person ever owning a single slave, but it is to provide some important context. I think we're all, not to excuse any wrong or any evil, but we're all products of our time and place. And slavery had been around since the beginning of man. And tragically, that was still the norm in this country and throughout the rest of the world in the 1860s. And unfortunately, like the rest of the world, America in the 1860s was a deeply racist country, drenched in terrible racism. And it's important to remember that when Abraham Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, that was an extremely unpopular document, not just down south, but up north. Numerous northern state legislatures denounced it, passed resolutions condemning it. And the Northern Union Army desertions peaked in the immediate wake of the Emancipation Proclamation. So many Northern soldiers said, we are not fighting to get rid of slavery or for Black Americans.
Well, I thought his main purpose of doing that was to undermine the military and productive potential of the South.
Yes, that's correct.
Because it only had to do with states that were in what they called rebellion.
Exactly. The fact is that you're right. The only slaves who were freed on paper by the Emancipation Proclamation were those slaves in those parts of the South that were not presently occupied by Union troops. So that meant 0 slaves were freed. In fact, in 1861, when Union General John C. Fremont took over Missouri, which was a slave state, and General Fremont promptly freed all the Missouri slaves. Well, Abraham Lincoln immediately countermanded that order, re-enslaving all of the slaves, and promptly fired General Fremont. And remember, there were many Union states, pro-Union states, whose soldiers were fighting in the Union armies who had slaves. I mean, Washington, D.C., for the first year of the war, and throughout the war, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And then Lincoln, while he said the 11 Confederate states could not secede from the Union in 1861, he said, absolutely, the western portion of Virginia, West Virginia, can secede from the Confederacy in 1863 and keep all of its slaves, as it did for almost all the remaining 2 years of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation was designed to encourage slave revolts in the South, slaves to escape in the South. it was also, I think, designed to appease Lincoln's abolitionist wing of the Republican Party. And maybe most importantly of all, the Emancipation Proclamation was designed to prevent the British and other European powers that wanted to trade with Dixie, with the American South, because we produce the world's best cotton and the world's best tobacco. There was a lot of sympathy for the South during the war between the states in Europe. And indeed, at the end of the war, the Pope himself gave a gift to Confederate President Jefferson Davis of a crown of thorns engraved. It was some kind of a gift depicting a crown of thorns. So the fear that Lincoln had and his Secretary of State William Seward had was that the British, especially with all their textile mills, dependent on Confederate cotton that was no longer getting to the British because of Lincoln's Anaconda Plan, his naval blockade of the South. Lincoln was afraid that the British would enter the war on the side of the South, or at a minimum would diplomatically recognize the Confederacy.
Well,
but Lincoln knew
all
that
that
strong abolitionism in Britain, and that would prevent the British government from siding with the Confederacy.
Well, all that said, and I want us to be sure we stick with Longstreet.
Yes.
Now, Longstreet, it's my understanding that you live in Gainesville, Georgia.
Yes.
And that's where Longstreet ended his life. He lived there for 30 years or something toward the end of his life?
Yes, from 1875 until his death in 1904. And of course, he was reared in Augusta, Georgia until well into his teens.
Well, I'm getting all this from you the other night, that the war, for those of you who don't know, ended in 1865.
Yes.
And so there was for example, as the war came to an end and the Army of Northern Virginia was being defeated, some people said, "Oh, let's start a guerrilla warfare and disperse the troops and let them go up into the mountains and hold out and all that." And Lee said, "No, that's not what we're going to do." And
right.
and Longstreet was still part of the Army of Northern Virginia, even though he had suffered wounds during the war.
Almost died.
And the loss of his family, that he'd had
3 children.
Yeah, 3 children. It's sad, but at any rate. So then, talk about what happened after the war, because I think this is where I want our listeners, whether they be in the United States or they be abroad, I want them to hear about this fine man and what happened to him. You and I talked this afternoon, and I mentioned how when a black man, a freed slave, came to worship in the Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, mm-hmm. and there was consternation among plenty of people in the congregation, but who got up and welcomed him in? And it was Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And that's important, I think, for people to understand that the relations were not simple. History is not simple. And that's quite a theme we're going to come back to over and over. So let's talk about what happened with Longstreet after the war.
Yes. First of all, let me point out, James Longstreet was first, last, and always a Christian. And after that, he was a great family man. And after that, he was a great American patriot. He went to West Point Military Academy, and he served his country honorably on the battlefields of Mexico in the Mexican-American War, where he was promoted for battlefield bravery, not once, not twice, but thrice. And even though he was the biggest human target on the battlefield at 6 feet 2 inches in height, weighing 200 pounds, which was almost a giant by the standards of the mid-19th century, he would always, the man who said, "You can't lead from behind," didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. Longstreet would always lead his men at the point of the spear on the front lines, carrying the regimental colors, and he was wounded severely and almost died. And Longstreet had a great career as a U.S. Army military officer. and he defended frontier families after the Mexican-American War. And he, as you pointed out correctly, he never owned a slave. And like General Robert E. Lee, the top commanding general of the Confederate Army, Longstreet opposed secession. But in 1861, Americans were far more loyal to their state and to their region of the country than they were to the nation as a whole. And even though Longstreet did not want Georgia, his state, and the South to secede, he certainly didn't want any war. As a military man, he knew better than anyone how horrible war was. Longstreet believed he couldn't stand by idly as a massive Union army was about ready to invade his homeland. And I believe Longstreet believed that, look, what do we celebrate every Independence Day but the 13 original American states seceding from the British Empire? And so that's why I call what most Americans call the Civil War, the war between the states, because a civil war is when you have two factions of a country fighting for control of the same government. The 11 Confederate states seceded from the U.S., just like the original 13 states seceded from the British Empire, and we formed our own separate government. And the Union armies invaded us to bring us back. Well, after the war ended, Longstreet believed, like Robert E. Lee, that we needed to do all we could, as soon as we could, to bind up the nation's wounds, to heal this great republic, to bring us back together, to unify us. Indeed, General Longstreet said, my dream is to live long enough to see my comrades in arms march arm in arm with the Union veterans up Pennsylvania Avenue, and then I will die happy. And he dedicated the next almost 40 years of his life to bringing about that reunification of this greatest of all nations. And he believed that to do that, he needed to accept all the offers of important federal government posts to help rebuild the nation after this terrible war. And he shocked the whole world when in 1867, just 2 years after the war ended, he came out publicly, forthrightly and absolutely unswervingly in favor of full civil rights for all the former slaves. He spoke out in favor of equal rights for all the former slaves, and he wrote a letter to a New Orleans newspaper indicating this as well. And this was just stunning because the nation, North and South, and the whole world was tragically, terribly racist at that time. And remember, even in the immediate, during the war between the states and immediately after the war between the states, in so many northern states, Black Americans had no right to vote. They had very few rights. They were not slaves, okay, but they had nowhere remotely as many rights as white Americans. And indeed, President Abraham Lincoln said in the last days of his life that in Union-occupied Louisiana, with a pro-Union Reconstruction, pro-civil rights government in 1865, at the end of the war, Black folk in Louisiana had more rights than Black folk in Lincoln's native Illinois. Illinois had a law which said that no Black person could stay legally in the state for more than 3 days, or he would be publicly flogged. I mean, that's how racist this country was, South and North. Well, Longstreet stunned the world when in 1867, he announced to everybody in public that he believed that all the rights that were guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, granted to all people by God and guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution to white Americans, should be equally guaranteed to all Black Americans. And he was so radical in this regard, especially for his time, that he favored even equal voting rights for all Black men. That was absolutely unfathomable to most whites. Remember, Longstreet went way beyond even anything Lincoln wanted. Lincoln only wanted those black men who had either fought in the Union Army during the war and or were literate to have the right to vote. But Longstreet said, no, if all white men have a right to vote, all black men should enjoy an equal right to vote. Their vote should count every bit as much as the votes of white men. And this
tell me something, and because this didn't come up, but did he ever take a stand on the enfranchisement of women? Because that came up during his lifetime, at least in England. Do you know?
I do know that he was an advocate of women's rights. His second wife, his first wife, Maria Louisa, with whom he had a wonderful marriage, she died in 1889. And then 8 years later, he remarried, and he married the legendary Helen Dorch Longstreet, who was one of America's first suffragettes fighting for the right for women to vote. She was the first lady to ever work for the state government of Georgia. He was the first female personal assistant to a governor of Georgia. And so she was quite a crusader for women's rights and for black civil rights. So yes, James Longstreet was quite radical, a century ahead of his time, not just regarding racial equality, but for female equality as well. Now,
good, because we have girls in scouting now. You know that.
Right.
Of course, you've had the Girl Guides and all that all around the world. So it's not. But I thought that would be a point I would be asking: were I a girl? And
absolutely,
and listening to this thing. And so, what was the deal there? So go ahead now. And now talk about these. You say what about these offices he held? Like, I believe, didn't you say he held some kind of a federal office in New Orleans?
Many. Can I, before we leave civil rights, I'd say just a little bit more about that. James Longstreet didn't just talk the talk and write the right. He walked the walk. Just as he was incredibly brave on the battlefield, he was arguably maybe even braver off the battlefield. He was in a much smaller minority regarding his position on civil rights. He was a century ahead of his time in his racial views. Well, Longstreet, because he was by far the most prominent Confederate general to favor racial equality, in New Orleans, where he settled after the war between the states, and New Orleans in the 1860s and 70s, that was the state capital of Louisiana. It will be later that it would become Baton Rouge. Well, because Longstreet was such a staunch defender of civil rights, the Louisiana state government after the war between the states was a pro-civil rights Republican government, a Reconstruction government, and it guaranteed civil rights for the recently freed slaves. Well, the state government asked General Longstreet, as this great, super successful military warrior, if he would please be the commanding general of the Louisiana State Militia or Louisiana National Guard. And he agreed. And so he commanded a mostly black Louisiana State Militia propping up the extremely unpopular state government, pro-civil rights Republican state government in Louisiana. And in fact, on September 14th, 1874, there was a vigilante white racist army of 8,400 men, and they were called the White League, and they were marching on the state government of Louisiana in New Orleans, and they were going to overthrow it and then overturn all the civil rights gains for black Louisianans. And James Longstreet defended the state government with just a 3,600 man, mostly black state militia with some New Orleans police. I mean, his army was outnumbered over 2-1, but he still, faced off against this White League army. And Longstreet, wanting to avoid any bloodshed, he went out on horseback. You had these two armies facing each other, and Longstreet bravely rode out on horseback by himself, a la David versus Goliath, and went over to the other side to try to talk reason, try to talk sense to these vigilantes. And for his efforts, he was shot. Now, thank God it was a spent bullet. And so, he survived. He got a big bruise, but he was literally willing to take a bullet, and did take a bullet, for the cause of equal rights for all Americans, for all of God's children in this country, regardless of race or color. And he was willing to do that in 1874, almost a century before the mass of Americans would support equal rights for all Americans, regardless of race. Now, that, of course, made him incredibly unpopular with most white Southerners. And most white Northerners thought that Longstreet was too radical on race. But Longstreet believed, as the great Reverend John Knox, the Scottish Protestant Reformation leader and founder of the Scottish National Church, of whom the American branch is the Presbyterian Church. The Reverend John Knox said, any man on the side of God makes a majority. I'm paraphrasing. And Longstreet believed that right is right, whether it's popular or not. And Longstreet was a very brave man. He was willing to give his life for his beliefs.
Well, at this point, everybody, when they're saying, what is all this to do about aids to scouting? I want to quote the great, one of the scout laws, as a scout had to memorize it to become a tenderfoot back in the good old days. It says, scout is brave. It's the 10th scout law. It says he has the courage to face danger in spite of fear. And get this, and to stand up for the right against the coaxings of friends or the jeers or threats of enemies, and defeat does not down him. Now, yes, that standing up to the coaxings of friends, and or the jeers or threats of enemies. Now, aren't we talking about Longstreet here?
Absolutely. In terms of the lethal dangers he faced in battle, I've already talked about how he led his men charging in the Mexican-American War. Well, in the war between the states, he was on the front lines repeatedly throughout that conflict as well. And bullets were whizzing by him, and he was the biggest human target on the battlefield. But people were amazed. He remained completely calm. If he was scared, he didn't show it. And he was like an island of calm in a sea of chaos. And that really helped bolster his leadership credentials, because when everyone else is terrified and they see a leader like Longstreet who is unmoved, who's not perturbed, he's not shaking, he's not quaking in his boots, people gravitate to him like a magnet. They say, oh, he must know what's going on. And Longstreet was also somebody who could say no to his own friends. He lost a lot of friends because of his being a century ahead of his time on race. He was regarded by so many white Southerners as a traitor for daring to support Republican state governments endorsing and supporting civil rights. Longstreet was almost the only Confederate general after the war who joined the Republican Party, because the Republican Party was the party of civil rights for blacks. And so many white Southerners also grew to despise Longstreet because, as pointed out earlier, when various presidents who had fought in the Union Army during the war and who were Republicans, when they would offer him various important U.S. government posts, he would always say yes. So he was the customs surveyor or tax collector in New Orleans. He was the U.S. commissioner of railroads. And gosh, in the late 19th century, the railroad industry was the most important industry in the whole nation because it was the glue linking the raw materials of the South and West with the factories and the markets of the North and the East and the rest of the world. And today's equivalent of the U.S. Commissioner of Railroads would be the U.S. Cabinet level U.S. Transportation Secretary. Longstreet was also the U.S. Marshal of Georgia, and as U.S. Marshal, he used his authority to guarantee, to enforce civil rights for Black Georgians. He was the postmaster of the Gainesville, Georgia Post Office. He was also the minister, the U.S. minister to the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, present-day Turkey. Man,
how long did he serve in that capacity?
It was about a year. But the Ottoman Empire was the mightiest Muslim, Arab, Middle Eastern empire in history. And he was no seat warmer in that job. He was personally very influential with the ruling sultan. In fact, Longstreet persuaded the ruling sultan to allow an American archaeological expedition to go up to the top of Mount Ararat in Turkey in search of Noah's Ark. Longstreet was even a member of the Hall County Board of Education. He served on his local school board. So he literally gave almost his entire adult life to public service. And he was super successful in everything he did. I mean, he almost had the Midas touch. He could have easily, if he had really wanted to, he could have been a very wealthy man. But he didn't believe in becoming wealthy. As the Bible says, man does not live by bread alone. Longstreet, as a devoted Christian, believed that he could best serve his God by serving his fellow man. And, the Bible talks about how if you want to be a real leader, you should serve, you should minister to the people like Christ. And that's what Longstreet did, no matter how unpopular he was in doing it.
Well, the other night you also talked about, and you've mentioned this evening, the how there's been sort of a rehabilitation of Longstreet.
Yes.
And so if you'll just mention that first, The Killer Angels, that book by William Shera.
Michael Shara.
Sorry.
Right.
And so that was a book essentially about the Gettysburg campaign, as
yes,
I recall it. And
right.
and it was Lee insisted on a frontal assault on entrenched troops, or fairly entrenched troops, and and Longstreet was against it because he had seen just months before a terrible defeat of Union troops at Fredericksburg.
That's right.
And kids, people listening, all this you can actually find on Wikipedia, believe it or not. And because Wikipedia, modern things get kind of distorted by all these people that can go in and they have a political axe to grind and all that. But you can find out about the Battle of Fredericksburg, and then followed up by the Battle of Chancellorsville, and then the invasion of the North that terminated at Gettysburg, and the great defeat. And Longstreet was against that kind of a frontal assault because he was the kind of general who did not believe in the needless waste of life if he could avoid it. Now, Napoleon was not that way. Napoleon was just terrible about sending masses of troops up against the British squares and the heavy musketry and artillery. But Longstreet was a student of modern warfare, and so I think that's fair to say. But now that rehabilitation also has taken the form of, there's a movie that some of you might wish to see called Gods and Generals.
It's very good.
That kind of shows how people thought on both sides, not just the South. And it's not trying to make everybody a hero, but there was what would you call it? A certain chivalry that took place, at least at certain levels of that conflict.
Right. And that was consonant with the Victorian era. People placed great value on being Christian ladies and gentlemen and being very formal and being as friendly as possible. You're absolutely right that General Longstreet was way ahead of his time, not just racially and regarding women's rights, but regarding warfare. As a devout Christian humanitarian, he wanted the absolute minimum loss of life in war. And he believed, based on his study of military history and his experience on the battlefields of Mexico and in Virginia during the war between the states, that way too many generals on both sides were just hurling massive human wave assaults at the enemy against entrenched positions. And these were just suicidal. And of course, we saw a lot of this in World War I. It was just insane, bloodbath, needlessly. Well, General Longstreet, he was a master of offensive and defensive warfare, but he was especially ingenious and revolutionary in terms of defensive warfare. He believed that we needed to do what the Duke of Wellington did vis-a-vis Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815 in Belgium, when the Duke of Wellington, he staked out, he found the battlefield first, and he dug in on higher ground and made Napoleon come to him and defeated Napoleon in that battle. Well, Longstreet had done the same thing, as you point out, in December of 1862 in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Longstreet got there first. He dug in on higher ground and made the Yankees come to him, and he just annihilated the enemy. And Longstreet tried to persuade Robert E. Lee that if Lee was determined to send the Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania to try to relieve the people of Virginia from all the battles that have been fought there, and to try to maybe intimidate the Northerners into pressuring President Lincoln to sue for peace, Longstreet said, if we must go into Pennsylvania, let's make sure that we fight on the defensive, that we dig in on higher ground and make the enemy come to us. But Lee was just obsessed with attacking the northern armies at Gettysburg. And so on July 2nd and July 3rd of 1863, in the second and third days of that three-day battle, Lee ordered the Confederate Army to just engage in these human wave assaults against very heavily fortified, dug in on higher ground defensive northern positions. And it was a bloodbath. That was the real turning point in the war.
For some reason, when I think about scouting, I keep coming back to this.
Good.
I don't know if you've read much about the siege of Mafeking during the Boer War, where Baden
in South Africa.
Mafeking. I always said Mafeking, but it's Mafeking, whatever. All right, at any rate. And so you've probably read about that and how Baden-Powell was the officer in charge, and he fought an entirely defensive operation, and very cleverly and very thriftily, if that's the way to put it. Although war is always such a terrible waste, but it was just something that I think all scouts know about that, or younger ones maybe don't. But again, there's Wikipedia. All you got to do, kids and folks, is just look it up. And it's
right.
Oh, and I was going to say something else a while ago, and that's Baden-Powell served in the Ashanti Matabeleland campaign. He was there in the Boer War. He had a great admiration for Black troops they are not just Western trained ones, but the whole Zulu kind of not their mass attack type formations, but their individual warrior training and how they toughened up boys to be warriors and to be skillful. He had great, and of course he retired to Kenya. That's where he ended his life. And he had a great love for Africa.
And there were so many brave, outstanding Black soldiers who fought in the Confederate and Union armies during the war between the states. And let me say this, if I may, please. As unpopular as General Longstreet became with most white Southerners in the late 1860s and 70s and beyond because of his racial views, the men who knew General Longstreet the best, the soldiers who served under his leadership in the Army, in the First Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, they loved Longstreet. They never lost their respect, their admiration, their reverence for this man. And I think maybe the biggest reason they loved him was the fact that they knew that unlike the other generals on both sides of the war, Longstreet did not send them into needless human wave suicidal assaults. He really valued every life, and they admired how he was not some armchair General Way in the back, miles away from the front lines. He was on the front lines repeatedly. And so they knew that he was someone who was genuinely every bit as brave as they were.
We're not going to run out of time exactly, but one thing that was kind of interesting, and I don't think we need to get into it a lot, but why don't you say something about that second marriage of his? Because I found that pretty interesting. And you invited people to look into that lady's life. So tell about that.
Well, James Longstreet was so enlightened, not just racially, but regarding women's rights too. I mean, he was living in a time when women did not have the right to vote in most American states. Women did not have remotely equal rights to men. And here, who did he choose as his second wife? But as I said earlier, one of the first suffragettes in American history, Helen Dortch, was one of the first female newspaper reporters. And at 15, she was one of the first female newspaper editors and publishers. At 21, she was one of the first female essayists for newspapers, and first lady to work for the state governor of Georgia, first lady to work for the governor of Georgia as one of his personal assistants. So she was quite a famous women's rights pioneer. She was one of the first ladies in Georgia to ever earn a college degree from what's now Grinnell University in Gainesville in 1888. She was one of the very first career women in American history working outside the home. And none of that intimidated him at all. In fact, it only made him admire her all the more. He had been following her career in the newspapers before Georgia's civil rights and educational reform governor, William Atkinson, introduced him to his personal assistant, Miss Dortch. And they had a wonderful marriage. They were married for about 6.5 to 7 years. And it's a testament to the depth of her love for him, that even though she was this professional, college educated, career woman, she immediately quit work outside the home. And she devoted herself 24/7 to taking care of him. He was elderly and increasingly frail at that time. And she would not resume her career until after he died. And for the rest of her long life, and she lived until 1962. She died at age 99. For the almost 60 years that she survived him, she defended his reputation, and she did a great job rehabilitating it to a great extent. And you're so right, Walker, in what you said earlier about how General Longstreet's reputation has soared. I mean, it sort of bottomed out in the late 19th century, but even before he died, it was starting to come up. And now what happened was it was in the mid to late 1960s that finally a majority of Americans came to embrace the Longstreet view that we're all equally children of God, equally endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. And so once the civil rights movement succeeded in the mid-1960s in tearing down all the old racist Jim Crow laws, suddenly a new generation of Americans says, hey, this Confederate general over a century ago, he was way ahead of not just Southern whites, but Northern whites too. Wow, what an interesting character. And then, as you point out, in 1974, Michael Shara, and his last name is spelled Shaara, he wrote a novel called The Killer Angels. And it's a historical novel about the Battle of Gettysburg. And as perhaps his primary resource for his research for that book, he used General Longstreet's War Between the States memoir, which came out in 1896, From Manassas to Appomattox. And so Shara's novel, The Killer Angels, portrays General Longstreet in a heroic light. And for so long, Longstreet's enemies had lied about him. They said that he had lost the battle at Gettysburg, when that was not the case at all. If Lee had listened to Longstreet, we would have never fought at Gettysburg, and we certainly wouldn't have launched the human wave assaults of July 2nd and July 3rd. Well, in any event, so now a new generation of Americans is getting a very positive spin on the general, not just politically, but militarily as well. And then 19 years after The Killer Angels came out, Atlanta's Ted Turner of Turner classic movies, and you own the Braves and the Hawks. Ted Turner financed the Hollywood movie version of The Killer Angels called Gettysburg, released in 1993. And the fine actor, and he was very young and handsome and charismatic at the time, Tom Berenger, played General Longstreet, and Longstreet is portrayed as a hero in that movie. And so now the popular culture is really embracing General Longstreet as never before. And as so often happens, long after somebody dies, historians and political scientists start rehabilitating somebody in the history books. And so a series of books by various historians would come out from the 1980s on, praising General Longstreet, not just for his military genius, but for his bold civil rights leadership, for being so far ahead of his time racially, politically, morally. Books by Glenn Tucker and William Piston, Thomas Connolly and Barbara Bellows, Harold Knudsen, Ed Lowe, Jeffrey Wirt, and then most recently, the most acclaimed book to come out about the general was 2023's Longstreet, the Confederate general who defied the South. And that book by University of Virginia historian Dr. Elizabeth Verone has won I don't know how many national book awards. And so the great irony is that the general who was by far the most politically incorrect Confederate general in the South in the late 19th and early and mid 20th centuries is now the most politically correct because he was so far ahead of his time. And so Longstreet's reputation today is better than ever. The story of not just Longstreet's life, but how history has treated him illustrates that as the great Nobel Prize-winning novelist and short story writer William Faulkner of Mississippi put it, the past is not dead. In fact, it's not even the past. And the great author George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm and 1984, and I think 1984 is the best political novel I've ever read. Well, George Orwell wrote, "Whoever controls the past controls the future. Whoever controls the present controls the past." Whoever controls the past controls the future. Whoever controls the present controls the past. And what Mr. Orwell meant by that was that history is always being rewritten. And if you can, and this is why every year there are political battle royals fought in school boards all over America over which U.S. history books are going to be adopted, which U.S. history textbooks will be adopted by the school board for the local high school and middle school students. And think about it. If you can dictate who the next generation of young people is going to be taught are the heroes and the villains of their national history, wow, that is giving you a lot of power, because that young generation is going to teach their children and their grandchildren who they think are the heroes and villains of history. And that's going to affect how they're going to vote. And, you know, I don't know if it's still the case, but in recent decades, the most commonly used U.S. High school history textbook was Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Well, Howard Zinn was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And so people are getting a very biased communist perspective on American history when they read that textbook. If you look at other history textbooks written by people who are either liberal or conservative, they get a very different take on history. And so often, as I used to tell my students, you can tell a lot more about the attitudes and the views of the author of a history book than about the people that the book is ostensibly about.
Well, I was going to ask you if there was a 12-year-old listening or a 14-year-old that's there, and what could you recommend maybe 6 books, you know, if to read, you know, not just about U.S. history, but if a kid just said, I'm gonna make my own mind up about what's true and what's not true.
Right.
You've mentioned 1984.
Yes.
And when I was young, we also had Brave New World.
Yes, by Aldous Huxley.
Aldous Huxley, and that was a book that showed a world that was basically controlled by some sort of a amorphous central government that made sure everybody was trained to accept their place in society that was set for them basically by biological science and manipulation. And then, and so that one, and then of course, Animal Farm. And so those are 3 that I would recommend. And also, I can read long history books that are other people find boring. I find the 5 volumes or 6 volumes that Churchill wrote about World War II to be
for which he won the Nobel Prize.
Because it's not just about how to conduct the affairs of men, but it's also his writing was so good. His style.
Yes. But he was a journalist before he was a politician.
Yeah. Well, if you can, and he was a soldier before that. So
that's right. So, in South Africa, you're right.
And of course, that was how Baden-Powell was that way. He was came up in that school of the Victorian era and honor and bravery and imagination and military science. But could you name a couple of 3 other books that you would recommend to a 14-year-old?
Sure. And let me just say, read a good biography of Sir Winston Churchill. His life is so fascinating, not just for leading the British Empire to victory against the Nazis in World War II, but gosh, when he was fighting in South Africa, he was captured and then he escaped from captivity and wrote about it. I agree with you that Aldous Huxley's 1932 classic novel, Brave New World, is wonderful. George Orwell's 1945 novella, Animal Farm, is great. His 1949 novel, 1984, is just awesome. I would say that for a good U.S. history textbook, I liked, when I taught American history, I like to use George Brown Tyndall and David Shies SHI, History of the United States. And it was a narrative history. It told the history of America sort of like a novel. I mean, it was all factual, but I thought that it was pretty balanced. I didn't think it was too far to the right or to the left. Maybe my all-time favorite history textbook that I used was Bruce Perry's A History of Western Civilization. Bruce Perry's Western Civilization history book was about the history of ideas. And I believe that the real engines of human history is the history of ideas. Ideas drive human history more than anything else. And Bruce Perry's Western Civ history book does a magnificent job of talking about the influence of ideas, how the most important driving forces of humanity are ideas. And indeed, Victor Hugo, the great French playwright who wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Miserables, he wrote, there is nothing more powerful in this world than an idea whose time has come. And Benjamin Franklin, Napoleon Bonaparte said 3 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. And of course, Benjamin Franklin's version of that was the pen is mightier than the sword. And this is why there's always a battle for the minds of young people to try to influence people. And I would urge every Boy Scout and everybody to never just take what someone says or writes about history or anything at face value. Always think for yourself. Think critically, rationally, and always independently. Don't just take my word or Wikipedia's or Bruce Perry's or George Orwell, anybody's word. Read as many different sources as you can. And don't just read conservative sources or just liberal sources. Read as widely as you can to get as many different perspectives as possible so you can come to your own conclusions. Because I think it was Mark Twain who said, you can tell where a man stands by where he sits. We all have, if you want to be really blunt about it, you can make a very credible case that whatever your religious faith is ultimately an accident of geography, of time and place. I used to tell my history classes, think about it. If we had been born in, not Barnesville, Georgia, but Barnesville, Thailand, well, we'd be good little Buddhists. If we had been born in Barnesville, India, we'd be good little Hindus. If we'd been born in Barnesville, Saudi Arabia, we'd be good little Muslims. But because we were born in Barnesville, Georgia, we're Christians. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's just to say that we are all creatures of our time and place. And if our descendants, if our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are lucky, hopefully 50, 100 years from now, we'll all be regarded as primitive barbarians. We're going to engage in what I call the sin of presentism, judging people of the past by the standards of the present. Nobody is going to withstand that scrutiny except Jesus Christ. Other than Jesus Christ, not one person who's ever lived will withstand that scrutiny. You give me any figure of history you want and give me enough time, and I will be able to find enough facts about him to where by just connecting, drawing a line, connecting those negative facts about him, I can portray him as a monster. I mean, it's very easy to do that with anybody. None of us lives in a glass house. I mean, we're all sinners. The Bible says that we all fall far short of the glory of God. We don't have to be perfect, though. And that's not to excuse any sin, but it is to say that we need to be realistic. Who is it in our lives who we have the most anger at various points, who we're the most upset by? The very people we love the most, our husbands, our parents, our children, our brothers, our sisters. We love the people we love the most are the people we've had the most fights with, the people we've had the most disagreements with. So, whenever we're looking at anybody from the past or present, let's be fair, let's be decent, and how do we want to be judged? Do we want to just be judged by our worst moments, our worst sins? Are we not light years more than those? We don't erect statues to people who are perfect. Well, nobody is perfect. We erect statues to people who we believe rose above their sins, rose above all their problems, all their turmoil. They rose above it and were able to achieve real moments of greatness. To me, the more someone had to rise up, the more someone had to struggle, the more someone had to overcome to achieve what he did, the more I respect him. I judge somebody by how far ahead of his time was he on various issues and how much did he grow. Well, let's emulate such people. And Longstreet is such an inspiration because he shows how you can rise above your time and place, and you can have the courage to be unpopular, to be disliked, to even be despised, and to lose friends over your views. But he was absolutely guided by his religious faith, his sense of right and wrong. And he ultimately now has a magnificent place in history, well-deserved, even though there are only 2 statues of him, and they weren't erected until 1998 at Gettysburg and 2001 in Gainesville. I was going to deserves a lot more.
And it's been good, but we try to keep these down to about the time we've done. And I would tell everybody that y'all have a Longstreet Museum there in Gainesville, Georgia.
Thank you.
So, and so everybody, I hope everybody around the world has enjoyed this, and I hope you'll, kids out there, people out there, I hope you've taken a lot of this to heart, and maybe, like I did the other night, found that you didn't know the whole story about things. And maybe some of the stories you've accepted all your life have been something that with some study, you might say, you know what? I don't think that was the way it really was back then. Elliot, what about you? You're over there smiling. You look like you're about ready to say, let's call it an evening. Any thoughts there?
No, I'm glad to know that there's a Longstreet Museum in Gainesville, and I'm going to include that in the description of the video.
That will be great.
Thank you.
All right.
I'll say that the Piedmont Hotel Museum, it's actually the formal title of the museum is the James Longstreet Museum at the Piedmont Hotel. And it's located at 827 Maple Street near downtown Gainesville, Georgia. And it's open every Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 4. And it's free for everybody. It is beautiful. Just last year in 2025, it was completely renovated to resemble the beautiful, magnificent Victorian era hotel it was from 1876 to 1895 when General Longstreet ran it. So many of the most important figures of American history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries visited the general there, like President Grover Cleveland, a young future President Woodrow Wilson, many other prominent people. And we have the general's desk there. It's wonderful. And I think that people would really enjoy a visit there. And Gainesville is a really pretty town.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope y'all around the world, I hope you've enjoyed this issue of the aids to scouting. And I hope that it will be an aid to all the scouting in your life.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah. Hang on a second, Doug. And good night, Elliot. Good night, Doug. Good night, world.
Good night.